Hello, everyone. Welcome to Lecture 11, Social Systems, Communication, and Behaviors. A couple of concepts that I want to make sure you understand in this lecture is communication, and then the social systems, as well as group behavior. So let's go ahead and get started. Every organism is constantly interacting with other organisms. This includes whether there's predation, mating, any type of social interaction. So a social behavior is an interaction with one or more conspecifics, and occasionally with individuals of different species as well. The social interaction can occur at different intervals and always requires some form of communication. So what is communication? So I define communication with three major components. It's the transfer of information, that's one, from a signaler, two, to a receiver, three. So again, those three components are the cooperative transfer of information from a signaler to a receiver. So for example, if we think about an auditory call, if one organism emits a call and that call is not received by a second individual, no communication has thus occurred. So communication involves more than one sense oftentimes, working together synchronously or perhaps acoustically or sequentially. There are four types of communication, and we'll go through each of these very briefly right here and in more detail in just a bit. First, we have visual communication. This may include body movements or distinct colors coupled with body movements. We also have acoustic communication, where you use sounds produced either by vocalization or rubbing body parts together. We also have chemical communication, where odors are derived from glandular secretions. It's very well developed in species or groups of species like salamanders, lizards, and some snakes even. And then lastly, we have tactile communication, where one individual rubs or presses or hits a body part against another individual. Overall, the benefit of communication is the high resolution ability to identify and locate mates in a complex environment. A complex environment could include things like a huge multi-species frog chorus in a very densely vegetated marsh. And the female's ability to not only recognize high-quality mates, but also select the best mate among all potential options. So let's talk about some of the groups and the ways in which they may communicate. First, we'll talk about salamanders. Social communication in salamanders is largely mediated by chemical and tactile cues. Chemical cues are developed using very well-developed courtship glands. These salamanders use these pherohormones to distinguish between species and to locate conspecifics. When a male encounters a receptive female, he may move beside her, undulate his tail, and otherwise try to get those pheromones to her snout. And as I mentioned, these hormones are produced by courtship glands, and we'll talk about a couple types of courtship glands here in just a minute. With regard to tactile cues, the mate location in plethodon salamanders is aided by nose tapping, and again, it's a way in which the males are physically administering or helping facilitate the female being able to assess him and his glands. And again, it's done through nose tapping. So the male will repeatedly touch his snout to the female's nasolabial grooves. And again, those nasolabial grooves help function to take those chemical cues up into the nostrils and the Jacobson's organ to be processed so the female can again assess that potential male. So let's take a look at some of these glands. If you look here on the left, we have a plethodontid salamander. And there's a small gland located on the chin. And you can see in some species, it's very small. Other species can be a little larger. In some species, it can be quite large. This gland is called a mental gland. So this mental gland is what is used oftentimes during the male. For example, we have the male plethodon jordani will do this nose tapping. So he has this mental gland at the very base of his chin. And when he's rubbing his tail in the female's belly, the female is a stippled individual. This is the male. He will lean over and take his mental gland and gently tap it right on top of her nasolabial grooves, and again facilitates delivering those hormones directly to that female snout, and so she can process his quality, and hopefully will result in the male depositing a spermatophore and the female inducting that spermatophore, and thus the male will sire those offspring. So that's one way in which plethodontid salamanders might communicate with one another using these pherohormones, or these hormones from the courtship glands. Well, what about ambystoma? Ambystoma have a little different way in which they might communicate with each other. And this is called a cloacal nudging waltz. And so here, if you look in the top of the screen, this is how the interaction generally begins. So this is the male. This is the female. You can see she's really large and gravid. Gravid means she's full of eggs. So the male usually interacts with the female. He'll first touch his snout against her snout, and then immediately his snout is touching her cloaca. Her snout is touching his cloaca, and the cloaca is located right here, for example, on this mole salamander. And that is also a courtship gland. So they are emitting courtship glands through each of their cloaca. So the female is assessing the male is assessing the female, and they'll spin around in a circle again, which is called a cloacal nudging waltz. And they'll engage in this cloacal nudging waltz until the female decides that this is a potential male that she would like to induct his spermatophore. The male will then begin to walk away, and he'll take his tail and tap it on the female and persuade her to follow. And then she will begin to nudge his cloaca and encourage him to deposit a spermatophore. She'll then move forward, induct that spermatophore. The male goes back off into the breeding pond, and the female finds a place to deposit her eggs somewhere underneath some submergent vegetation. So that's called the cloacal nudging waltz in ambystoma. Back to plethodontids, there's an additional way in which they communicate, and this is called the tail straddling walk. So again, the stippled individual is the female, the clear individual is the male, and the male will actually take his tail and continue to undulate it on the female's chest and belly. And there's also a small gland, a dorsal gland, right between, located on the top of the pelvis of the male, and the female will take her nasolabial grooves and continually assess both the cloaca as well as the top of the male during this tail straddling walk. He will lead her, deposit spermatophore, and she'll induct the spermatophore, and again, hopefully sire his offspring. So a couple of different ways in which salamanders will communicate with one another using tail straddling walks, cloacal nudging walks, nose tapping, all to help the females assess potential mates. What about frogs? With frogs, acoustic cues are incredibly important, and in fact, they're the primary mode of communication in anurans. There are 4 basic types of calls that we're going to go through. Advertisement call is the call that most of you are familiar with. Its function is to attract a conspecific gravid female. So these are the males emitting calls trying to attract a female. So males that have the deepest call, the call that is called the most frequently, all tend to be selected by females. We also have a reciprocation call. This one is very rare. This is given by a female in response to the call of a male. I've heard very, very few calls that I would consider reciprocation call, and I don't know too many species that do so on a regular basis. So advertisement calls, 90% of what you think about when you're thinking about anurans. Reciprocation is probably 0.1%. We also have a release call. And now remember, we talked about amplexus, and remember some of these amphibians, particularly anurans, are aggregate breeding amphibians, which means they breed in large groups. And if you think about the Scaphiophus, these breeding events can occur over 1 or 2 nights, because the whole breeding season, from mating to laying eggs to metamorphosis, can happen within 2 weeks. So there are oftentimes in these breeding frenzies that males will amplex other males. And when that happens, males will utilize a release call. That's their way of saying that a male is being amplexed by another male. There's no real breeding opportunities there. So the amplexing male should release and try to find a female for external fertilization to occur. And then lastly is a distress call. This is a loud cat-like scream given by in any individual when it's being grasped by a predator. And probably the most prolific of the species that we have in Indiana that has the loudest, most impressive distress call is our American bullfrog. And if you've ever tried to catch one of these out by a pond or a large lake, and they let out this large whiny moan, that is indeed a distress call, and it's meant to shock you so that you drop the frog and they can get away. Now, frogs produce all this sound by passing air over their vocal cords back and forth between their lungs, the vocal cords, and their vocal sacs. So let's take a look at what that looks like. So here we have a schematic of a frog. Here we have a marine toad. Here's this large vocal sac that I'm talking about. Here's the external nares, the nostrils where air is being brought in. Here's the larynx or the vocal cords, and here's obviously the lungs. So the frogs will inhale and basically pump up their vocal sac by inhaling air into the vocal sac until it's fully distended. Then they will close off their nostrils, and then they will push the air from their vocal sac across the larynx into the lungs, from the lungs across the larynx back into the vocal sac, back and forth repeatedly in order to make those long frequency, high pitch, low pitch frequency duration calls that are so characteristic of many of our neuron species. There's also some visual cues with frogs, and these are usually in the form of bright colorations coupled with body movements, but this is found mostly in diurnal species. If you think about the species that rely primarily on acoustic communication, that's occurring at night, and so there's already limited visibility, and oftentimes these are vegetation choked habitats, so low visibility and nocturnal setting, primarily acoustic. When you have visual communication, it's usually bright colorations accompanied by body movements in more open habitats. So let's take a look at some example species that might utilize this. The golden frog is a classic hand waver. So the males are this fairly bright golden coloration, and they do have a weak voice, but they primarily rely on waving their hands. So if you Google golden frog hand waving in YouTube, some really phenomenal videos on YouTube will show up and show how these golden frogs are communicate with each other using hand waves. What about chelonians? Chelonians use a combination of head bobs as visual cues, as well as tactile cues, ramming, trailing, biting, tickling, and we'll talk about an example of tickling here in just a minute. But they also rely on chemical cues, and these are from special glands on the bridge of the shells. These are the same glands that I talked about with the Kynosternidae that emit that really foul-smelling odor that takes 2 or 3 days to wear off. Those are the same glands that will oftentimes secrete a substance, will allow males and females to chemically communicate with one another, as well as different species communicate with one another. Cloacal secretions are also known to play a vital role in communication with turtles. So really the classic example, if you think about our red-eared slider that we have right here in Indiana. So this is a male. For those of you who have the lab, you're able to differentiate males and females. And the secondary sexual characteristic in the red-eared slider are these really long claws that males have. And these long claws are used to tickle the cheeks of a female. So here's a female, you can see she has really small claws. Here's a male, you can see how long his claws are. So in the red-eared sliders, he will swim in front of the female, take both of those palms, turn his palms outward, and then take those long claws and tickle the cheeks of the female to entice her to swim down in the bottom of the pond and ultimately copulate and hopefully sire some offspring. What about our squamates? What about our lizards? Most species of lizards rely on a combination of visual, chemical, and tactile cues for their social interactions. So let's talk about visual cues. The coloration of dewlaps or heads or sides of the body in males. And oftentimes, again, they're accompanied by body movements to highlight those highly colored areas of the body. We have pheromones with regard to chemical cues, which are very, very well developed in some of our skinks. We have a lot of tongue flicking as well as neck and body scratching in terms of tactile cues with lizards. Again, a lot of diversity because there's a lot of diversity in our lizard species. One of the things that is really well studied is the communication in anolis lizards. And they're known for having these dewlaps, and this is a dewlap that's being extended right here on the chin of this particular male. So these dewlaps are extended, folded, extended, folded, as well as head bobs. So another way of thinking about the head bobs are push-ups or press-ups. So these dewlap displays are combined with head bob displays, and these displays are all species specific. So in these figures, each figure is showing the color of the dewlap and a pattern of head bobbing and dewlap extension. So let me walk you through what all these are showing. So the solid lines below each lizard show about 10 seconds of head bobbing. So from here to here is 10 seconds. The height of this solid line is indicating the extent to which the head is lowered and raised. So you can see in this individual, the extent of head raising much higher and more pronounced in this individual and much more subdued in this individual. So you can see there's a certain intensity of head bobbing and a certain frequency of head bobbing that's associated with the males that have each of these distinctive dewlap colorations. Now the dashed line below is showing the dewlap extension. So here the dewlap is being extended a single time and for a long duration, coupled with this frequency of head bobs. And this individual, you can see this frequency of head bobs and a double dewlap extension. And again, the same sort of pattern that you see in this other individual. So these are called simple displays. We also have compound displays where the dewlap has a central color surrounded by a second color. So here's a central color and a second color. Here's a central color and pattern and a second one, and the same thing for this other individual. The lines up top indicating the same thing, head bobbing, the lines on the bottom, dewlap extension. And lastly, we have complex displays. In a complex display, the dewlaps have an intricate pattern of 2 or more colors with head bobbing and dewlap extension. So again, much more complex dewlap patterns and structures coupled with dewlap extension and head bobs. So again, that's just another really well-studied way of which anolis lizards are able to communicate with one another, and males and females can communicate within the same species, but also within the different sexes. What about snakes? Tactile signals are really important by snakes and used during courtship and mating. It really involves 3 phases. There's a tactile phase where there's a lot of chemosensory sampling of males to determine sex of the individual, hopefully a female, usually followed by chases. So the male will track her or chase her and attempt to copulate with the female. The male will place his body alongside the female or loop part of his body over the female's dorsal surface, oftentimes a lot of rubbing. There's a tactile alignment in the second phase where there's a first attempt to copulate, and then there's intromission and copulation, which is a final phase of the mating system as well. And so here you see some eastern garter snakes. Here's a large female, and you can see a wad of males that are trying to gain access to this females, and these are oftentimes called breeding balls. And again, if you search for eastern garter snake mating balls, some really cool YouTube videos that various people have put together over the years to see how these males are trying to interact with these females and gain access to her. Let's talk about some group behaviors. And first is competition. And this is one we've talked about a couple of times. And all I really want to bring to your attention is interspecific competition. And this occasionally occurs among related species, but inter means between, so this is between species. Okay? Frequently congregating species partition habitat temporally. So think about a temporary pond where there might be 6 or 8 different anurin species. So they might not only partition the habitat based on habitat type, but also temporally. Some species are there earlier, some species are there later, some species are in low vegetation, some species are in high vegetation. So they're partitioning that habitat out temporally as well as spatially to minimize interspecific competition. Intraspecific, intra means same, so now we're talking about competition within the same species, and it usually occurs when resources are limited. These resources could be access to mating sites or basking sites or food or water, whatever that particular habitat limitation could be. So it occurs when resources are limited. And it is minimized in larval, particularly embryonic forms, for reasons we've already talked about. I'm not going to say much more, but I want you to be thinking about why that might be minimized in particularly embryonic forms. Now, the converse of competition is cooperation in terms of group behavior. So let's talk about cooperation. And there's only two forms that I want to share with you as I end today's lecture. And that first is hibernation, and the second is breeding aggregations. If we think about hibernation, it's really individuals congregating. In this case, we're talking about snakes that are congregating in a hibernacula. And originally it was thought that snakes were doing so for some sort of thermal advantage, but there's really no evidence that they gain a thermal advantage by congregating in groups. But there is thought to be an advantage in minimizing evaporative loss. So it helps maintain moisture in these cold winter months when we know humidities can be really, really low. So they hibernate. A lot of different species will hibernate in hibernacula collectively, again, to minimize that evaporative water loss. And last, we have breeding aggregations as a form of cooperation. Well, you might think, well, if there's 40 different individuals in a breeding pond versus 8 individuals, it seems like there's a lot more competition in the groups that have higher densities. And there is certainly some truth to that, but there's also some cooperation and advantages in those breeding aggregations. So think about a scenario where you are a female and you're trying to find breeding males, and there's only 2 males in a breeding pond, and you're 2 miles away from that pond. And those 2 males calling, their calls may not go very far because there's only 2 of them. But if there's 200 males in that breeding pond, the chorus, the decibels are much louder, the sound will carry much, much further, so the females are actually able to find those breeding ponds much more quickly, much more effectively. And then when they get to the breeding ponds, if you've ever really listened to frogs in a chorus, they will oftentimes partition themselves temporally. So you'll hear a frog, a male call, he'll stop, and then the second male will call. A third male will then call. So they're trying to call in the gaps when other males are not calling as a means to minimize that intraspecific competition during their calling. But again, it is cooperation when they're calling collectively as a chorus to attract an individual to the breeding site in the first place. So that's a form of cooperation as well. And so that pretty much does it for our lecture 11 on social systems and group behavior. I hope you join me soon to talk about predation, defense, and escape. We'll see you soon.